Okay, everyone, I suggest we get started. Just as I said, if anyone has not seen the source sheet, I posted a link for that in the chat. So let me just get myself sorted. Okay, there we are. So the title of the shir that I wanted to look at this evening is the Kezayis Conundrum, how much should I eat? And as you would probably have guessed, so the question underlying this is how big is a Kezayis? Now, a Kezayis is a quantity of volume which is really relevant across many different areas in halacha. Probably the most common area where it's relevant, though, one which comes up daily, is with regards to making a bracha achrona. So we know when we eat food, to make a bracha beforehand, a bracha achrona, we only have to eat, even the tiniest amount, one would have to make a bracha. But to say a bracha achrona, one has to eat a quantity of a certain significance, and that quantity is a Kezayis. And so the question is, how much is a Kezayis, which would require one to make a bracha achrona? Now, my first interest in the topic that I can remember arose when I was in yeshiva, and I remember having a discussion with one of the rabbonim at the time about how many rogalach one would have to eat in order to say a bracha achrona. The Rav who I was speaking to said he thought it was going to be one rogalach, and me, based on my rather limited knowledge at the time, was trying to argue that it was 2 or 3. Now, that might help you understand why I put on a certain amount of weight in yeshiva. But the truth is, once I looked into it rather more, there are a range of opinions, and we'll hopefully see it's quite an interesting topic, and it touches on analysis of Gemara, it touches to some extent on maths and science, and there's also a little bit of archaeology as well. I can see a couple of people have just joined, so I'll just repost the link to the source sheet in the chat. There we go. So anyone who's joined who hasn't seen the source sheet, that is in the chat. Why have I picked the topic this week? So it has 2 links to this week's parasha, and if we look into source number 1, so we have the famous pasuk of Eretz Chita Ora V'Gefen Eseino V'Rimon Eretz Zeis Shem and Advash. The pasuk talks about the Shivas Haminim, the 7 species which Eretz Yisrael is praised with: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and honey. And the Gemara in Sukkah on Daf Hey and Daf Vov in source number 2 quotes Rav Chanin. Omar Rav Chanin said, Kol ha-posuk hazeh l'shirin ne'amar. This whole posuk is said in relation to quantities of volume which are relevant in different areas in the Torah. And when it looks at the phrase Eretz Zeis Shemen, it says Eretz Sharo Shioreho Kezeisim. It's the land where the majority of its quantities are like olives. So the Kezayis is a quantity which relates to many different areas. As Rashi in source number 3 quotes various different examples. So you have mace and nevela. So these are with regards to being able to pass on tumah. So having a Kezayis of a dead body, or a Kezayis of nevela would be able to transmit tumah, nevela when it's eaten, or that would be, can contract tumah when you eat the Kezayis and nevela. That would also make one liable for malchus. Similarly, the Isur Chelev V'Dam, eating forbidden fat, blood, pigel, nosa, retome, different types of kodshim, which one is not allowed to eat in the Gid Hanosha. So Rashi just quotes a sample of many different areas in relation to eating where the volume of a Kezayis is relevant. And the second link to this week's parasha about the size of a Kezayis comes in source number 4, which is said in relation to benching. We've already said that for bracha achrona, Kezayis is the relevant share, and the same is true for benching. And the Gemara in source number 4 quotes a nice idea in the name of Rav Avira. So Darash Rav Avira expounded, Zimnin Amar Lot Mishmeit Rabbi Ami, the Zimnin Amar Lot Mishmeit Rabbi Asi. Sometimes he said it in the name of Rabbi Ami, sometimes in the name of Rabbi Yassi. So Amri Malachei Hasharis Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the angels said to Hashem, Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the world, Kosev b'Sorasecha Asher lo yisaf fonim v'lo yikach shochad. It says in your Torah that a judge should not show favor and a judge should not take bribes. But you, God, you show favor and favoritism to the Jews. Because it says in Birkas Kohanim that Hashem should show you favor. So it challenged, how can God show favor to the Jews if we know that a judge is supposed to be completely impartial? So Amar Lohem, and he said, Hashem replied to the Malachim, should I not show them favor? Shekosavti lohem b'Torah, I wrote in the Torah, v'achalta v'savata v'irachta es Hashem Elokei echad. So this is a posuk in this week's Sedra. You should eat, be satisfied, and then bless Hashem. So this is the mitzvah of benching, which on the Torah level only applies if one eats food to the point of satiation. But but the Jews, they are careful upon themselves to bench even if they only eat the kezayis or a kibetza bread. So midrabanon, when one eats a kezayis of food, one has to bench, even though one does not feel satisfied. Chazal instituted to say benching even on this lesser amount. And Hashem says that the Jews are showing their love for my mitzvahs and they want to go beyond the letter of the law, so I must surely go beyond the letter of the law with them. So when we're talking about a judge, that would refer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu acting with us out of a strict midas hadin, acting as a strict judge. However, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, also acts with us out of love and out of kindness, and when we do things which go beyond, then that leads to Hashem acting with us not as a judge, but acting with us out of kindness and going beyond that which is warranted just by strict justice. So those are the two links where Kezayis relates to this week's Sedra with regards to the Shivas Haminim and with regards to benching. Now, when we start looking at the views about how large a Kezayis is, we'll see they largely divide into three different camps, but with a kind of a complication which affects the first two views. So if we start off in source 5, and this is the source for Re quoted in Tosfos in Yuma, and his view about the size of a Kezayis. So Re quotes this Gemara in Yuma on Daf Pei, brought in source number 5. So Tumas Ochlim Kibetza. So Tumah in relation to a food is with kibetza. So there's a machlokes to show you what this means, but certainly once a food is tomei, for that food to be able to pass tumah on to something else, we say that food has to be a kibetza inside. Some Rishonim also say a food can't even become tomei unless it's a kibetza, but that's not uniformly agreed. But to pass on tumah to something else, the food has to be a kibetza. So Minolan, how do we learn this? So Rabbi Abahu says, Mikol ha'ochel asher yi'ochel, from any food which can be eaten. And just in source number 6, you quote the full posuk, Mikol ha'ochel asher yi'ochel, from all the food that can be eaten, asher yovel olav mayim yitma, which water falls on will become tomei, v'chol mashke asher yichoseh v'chol kli yitma, and any liquids which will be drunk will also become tomei. So it says Mikol ha'ochel, from all the food that can be eaten. So how do we interpret from all the food? It seems to be that Rabbi Abahu is going to interpret it as the entirety or the maximum amount of food that you can eat. So ochel she'ata ochel b'vat achas. This is the amount of food that a person can reasonably eat in one go. V'shiru chachamim, and chachamim estimated that ein beis habliam machalzik yosem ebeitz hatarnagoles, that a person's throat would not be able to hold more than an egg's worth of food at one time. And therefore we've said that you can that food is able to pass tumah on from the entirety or the maximum amount that can be eaten, and that amount, Chazal said, was a kibetza, an egg's volume of food. So that's the first source, and then Re looks at another source in source number 7, which also tells us where Chazal estimated the amount of food that a person's throat can hold. And the context is interesting, but more complicated, so not for now. So V'sheru Chachamim, the Gemara increases on Daf Yud Daled in source 7, says that Chachamim estimated the ein beis habliam machalzik yosem mishnei zeisim, that the person's throat is unable to hold more than 2 olives. So Re says, very simple, we've got a direct equation, a direct link here. The first Gemara said that a person's throat can hold an egg. The second one said that it can hold 2 olives. Therefore, by simple maths, 1 egg is the size of 2 olives, and therefore a Kezayis, it would be half of an egg. This is the first view, which is the view of Re and Tosfos. Now, this view of Re is the one which is widely quoted as being adopted by Rav Chaim Noah from the 20th century. He wrote a work on quantities, and so he says that one would follow this view of Re in terms of making a bracha achrona, that one would have to eat a volume of food which is half the size of an egg. And in source number 8, in Kuntres Hashirim, Rav Chaim Noah went out and measured some of these volumes, and he said that an egg With its shell, he said it was about 57.5 centimeters cubed, and without its shell, which is the one which he says is relevant for a brocha achrona, is about 44 centimeter cubed. So if you take half an egg, if you say kezayis is half an egg, then you roughly, he says you have to eat 25.6 centimeters cubed. I wasn't quite sure how that was half of 53.8, but that's, he adopts this view and says you have to eat half of the volume of an egg to say a brocha achrona, with a slight complication where he says if some of the food ends up between your teeth, you can't actually count that towards the brocha achrona. So he says you'd have to eat actually about 28.8 centimeter cubed in order to say a brocha achrona. This is the first view, the view of Ri, and the one which is widely quoted in the name of Rav Chaim Noah. Now, a question which we'll throw out now and touch on more a bit later is if we consider the size of modern olives certainly do not appear to be 25 centimeters cubed. So if we said that a kezayis is meant to be an olive, so how would we equate the two? So as an idea we'll get onto more later, but this view would have to say that when Chazal fixed this shear as an olive, in their time, seemingly the olives were bigger, and the olive that we see today, whilst they don't stack up to the size of half an egg, we would probably have to go down the route of saying that these decreased in size. However, we will discuss more about that as we go along. So that's the first view of Ri, that a kezayis is half the volume of an egg, which Rav Chaim Noah estimates at around about 26, 28 centimeters cubed. So if we move on to the second view, and this is a view which Achronim imply from the view of the Rambam and the view of Shulchan Aruch, and this is a halacha with regards to Erev Tchumen. Now, Erev Tchumen, just very briefly, is, we know on Shabbos, one is not allowed to walk outside the Tchum of a city, outside the kind of outer limit, and that is defined as 2,000 amos, roughly 1.5 kilometers outside a city. So one is not allowed to walk beyond that. However, Chazal instituted that if you were to place the food volume of 2 meals to one of the sides of the city, so for example, if 1,000 amos to the north of the city, you put this food of 2 meals, your location for Shabbos or Yom Tov is considered to be at that point, and then you could go 2,000 amos from there. So you could go a further 2,000 amos to the north, which would be 3,000 amos from the north of the edge of the city. And that's the concept of Erev Tchumen. And so the Mishnah in Erevin, in source number 9, asks how much food one needs to put in this Erev Tchumen. So kama hishir, how big is this? Mozen shtei sudas l'kol echad ve'echad. It's the amount of food of 2 meals, as I said, 2 meals for a person, for each person who wants to extend the tchum in that direction. And that is mezona l'chol v'lo l'Shabbos. And we said 2 meals, those meals. So Rabbi Meir says it's the amount of food one would eat at 2 meals on a weekday and not 2 Shabbos meals. Rabbi Yehuda says l'Shabbos v'lo l'chol, it would be 2 meals of the size one would eat on Shabbos and not the weekday. What exactly is going on over here? So we say both of these views intended to give you a more lenient and more reduced amount. Rabbi Meir says that you would eat smaller meals during the week. Rabbi Yehuda says no, because you have to eat 3 meals on Shabbos. You would end up having smaller meals in order to facilitate this. Certainly a modern day practice would be in line with Rabbi Meir that our Shabbos meals are rather bigger than weekday meals, despite the requirement of eating 3 meals on Shabbos. But basically these views intended for the smaller quantity of food. So how much is this? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Omer, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka said, this is mikika, this is based on a loaf of bread, a pundion, which can be bought for the amount of money, which was a pundion me'arba sa'in basela, from when you could buy 4 sa'ah of flour for 1 seller. Now I've put a table just under source 10 giving the exact maths of what's going on over here and how you get from the financial value of a pundion and the volume of a sa'ah to how these match up. But the bottom line of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka is this is a quantity which is 6 kibetzah, 6 egg volumes worth of food. That's what you need to have for your Erev Tchumen, and this is the psak of the Rambam. The Rambam says for Erev Tchumen you have 6 kibetzah. Now the Gemara in Erevin slightly earlier on gives you another measure of how much a person would eat in 2 meals. So in source number 10, It says the shtei sudas having shmona esrei grogros. The amount of food a person would eat in 2 meals is 18 dried figs. So again, by simple maths, we've said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch in the Mishnah said that you have 6 beitzah in this food of 2 meals. The Gemara says this equals 18 grogros, 18 dried figs, and therefore that leads to the equation that 1 beitzah is the same size in volume as these 3 dried figs. So what have dried figs got to do with Kezayis? So the Gemara in source 11 gives you an indication of how the source of a zayis, how the size of an olive compares to the size of a dried fig. So this is a Gemara in Shabbos. Now generally, when it comes to Shabbos, carrying items from Urshas HaYochid to Urshas HaRabim is a Torah prohibition, and generally speaking, that is when one takes out a grogeret, a dried fig's worth of food. The Mishnayos go through different volumes for different types of articles, but generally speaking, it goes based on a dried fig. However, if it's something which you indicated was particularly important to you, the Mishnah says that even if you carry a smaller amount than that, then one would also be chayav for breaking Shabbos if one carried this out to the street. So the Mishnah says in source number 11, Hamatzniya lezera, if the person has seed which he's planning to keep in order to plant his field, or a dugma, or for some kind of specimen, or a refill, or for medicinal purposes, and he carries this out to the street on Shabbos, chayav b'kol shehu, he would then be obligated, he will have carried a sufficient quantity to either have to bring a carbon or indeed to be chayav misa if the circumstances were right, even if he carried out a small quantity of these. One doesn't need to have a dried fig's worth, even if one carries a small amount of this seed, because one considers it important, then one is considered to have broken Shabbos on a Torah level by carrying this out to the street. Then the Gemara explains exactly what this kol shehu, this small amount, means. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Rabbi Meir said a person is obligated a carbon for breaking Shabbos, even if he were to just take out 1 grain of wheat, which is intended to serve. If he just carried out 1 grain, he would have broken Shabbos in a manner where he would be obligated to bring a carbon. And the Mishnah says, Peter, that surely this is obvious, kol shehu t'nan. Our Mishnah said that even if you carry out a small amount, you're obligated. So obviously that would seemingly mean even if you just carry out a grain of wheat. So the Gemara says, Mahu Datema, what would you have thought? You might have thought when the Mishnah said kol shehu, a small amount, is la'afuki megrogeret, to say you needed something smaller than a dried fig, but maybe one would still at the very least need to carry a Kezayis of the food into the street in order to be chayav. So Kamash Malon, so Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel teaches us in the name of Rabbi Meir that one doesn't say that one at very least needs a Kezayis, even if one only carries out even just a single grain, then one would be obligated to bring a carbon. What comes out clearly from here is the Gemara says that kol shehu means we don't need a dried fig, but maybe you would still need a Kezayis. So what this very clearly shows is that a Kezayis is less than the volume of a gregaris, less than the volume of a dried fig. And if we then go back to the equation that we built out based on the Sugi by Eretz Chumin and the Rambam, where we said 1 beitzah was the same volume of 3 grogros, therefore if a zayis is less than 3 grogros, then that means that 1 beitzah is going to be bigger than 3 kezesim. It's going to be bigger than 3 olives. Does that all make sense so far? Because I realised I didn't say at the beginning. If anyone has any questions, please do just take yourself off mute and ask me as I go along. So this is what comes out of here. As we said, that 1 beitzah is the same volume as 3 dried figs. And because a dried fig is bigger than a Kezayis, then that means that 1 beitzah is bigger than 3 kezesim, and that 1 Kezayis would be less than 1/3 of a beitzah. Now, how much less? And this will kind of be relevant for both this opinion number 2 and opinion number 3. But several poskim adopt the view that really it's just a little bit less than 1/3 of a kibetza. And therefore, one would really, in order to say a bracha achron or any other area where Kezayis is relevant, one would be looking at 1/3 of the volume of an egg. And this is brought out in the Pri Chodosh in Chaim Simtov Pevov, which is the simon talking about how much matzah one needs to eat on Pesach. So the Pri Chodosh says, Aval Didon the Kamalon Ka Rambam. Now we follow the Rambam. Kezayis Enu Elosh Lish Beitza Bekiriv. The volume of a Kezayis is about a third of an egg. As we said, from the above, it just shows that it's less than a third of an egg, but he's saying that it is approximately at that upper limit. And then, interestingly, going back to the question we asked about, well, what about modern olives were certainly smaller in size than half an egg of the first opinion. So he says, if we say that it's only a third of an egg, then that which we see in terms of the size of our modern olives does not go so far against this opinion, like the opinion of Ri in Tosfos, where an egg is 2 olives or an olive is half an egg. And he says that this view doesn't make sense at all, especially if we consider how big olives are. Because the Mishnayos in Kalim say, when we're looking at the volume of a Kezayis, one should be looking at the average size of a Kezayis. And he says it's certainly not logical from what we see of olives to say that an average olive is half the size of an egg. But if we go along the lines of this Rambam, that it's around about a third, this is more in line with the reality that we see in front of us. And a similar view to the Pri Chodosh that says it's around about a third of an egg. This is a grot on Mishlei, which I wouldn't have found myself. It's quoted in the Sefer Midas Shirei Torah of Rabbanish. And he quotes, interestingly, Isab the Zohar. It says in the Zohar, Shebasholish Beitzim Yish Asora Zeisim. In 3 eggs, there are 10 olives. So 1 Kezayis is 30% of a beitzah, 0.3 of an egg, which is just under 1/3 of the volume of an egg. So it comes out a pretty similar extent to the Pri Chodosh that we saw just above. So that is so we have the first opinion, which was Ri and Tosfos, that it is a Kezayis is half the volume of an egg. And then we have the view that the Pri Chodosh based on the Rambam and the Pesach of the Shulchan Aruch, who pass things like the Rambam in Erev Tchumen, that this is closer to 1/3 of an egg. Anyone have any questions thus far? Okay, let's assume not. So then, moving on to what I've called opinion 1b and 2b. So this is not really an extra opinion about the size of, about how the volume of an olive relates to that of an egg. This is the view of the Noda B'Yehuda, who actually modifies what we consider the volume of an egg. So instead of Chaim Noab seems to, he's measured eggs as we see them, and he said they were roughly 57 centimeter cubes. And then you've got either half of that or a third of that as a Kezayis, but then the Noda B'Yehuda has another view about how big eggs are, and therefore by implication how big the Kezayis are as well. And this comes out of a din in Shulchan Aruch and Yoreh Deah in Hilchos Challah about what volume of dough, what volume of flour rather, one needs to make in order to be obligated to separate challah from that dough. And Shulchan Aruch here brings 2 different ways of measuring this amount. So here we are in source number 14, Yoreh Deah, Siman Shin Kaf Daled. It says that Midah Shemachzik Mem Gimel Beitzim Chomesh Beitzah, you look at a vessel which would contain 43.2 times the volume of an egg. So you fill up a vessel that big, and then you know that you have to take challah from that 43.2 times the volume of an egg. Then the Ramah in Hagar, he quotes a different way of getting one to that same measurement. And he says, if you have a vessel, Hamasik Eser Etzba'os al Eser Etzba'os, which is 10 finger breadths by 10 finger breadths, Burim Sholosh Etzba'os V'Tshiyas Etzav V'Karov, and it's 10 finger breadths by 10 finger breadths by 3 1/9 finger breadths tall. That would get you the same volume. And if you have that amount of flour, you'd have to separate challah. And similarly, if we want all of the sides to be the same length, have a cube. If you have a vessel which is 6 and 7/9 of a finger breadth by 6 7/9 of a finger breadth by 6 7/9 of a finger breadth, then that would give you the volume of color as well. So as I put there, the maths, we've got these two different measures brought here. The Shulchan Aruch quoted 43.2 times the volume of an egg is the amount of flour you need. And the Ramah gives you a different measure, these 10 finger breadths by 10 finger breadths by 3 1/9. And that gives you 311.11 recurring finger breadths cubed. And if you were to narrow that down, that means that one egg's volume is the same volume as 7.2 finger breadths cubed. Now, the question is, how big is a finger breadth? We've discussed the potential volume of an egg, but what about finger breadths? So there's an interesting comment of the Tzlach, of the Noda B'Yehuda on the Gemara in Pesachim, where he says that he did a bit of an experiment to see how these two measures stacked up. This is an interesting point that great poskim, they didn't just learn Gemara, they did practical experiments and they looked practically where needed as to enable them to clarify what the halacha should be. So the Tzlach, he said he did a practical experiment to work out exactly what's going on over here. So in source number 15, and this idea, so challah is 43.2 eggs in volume. So Tosos Yomtov, Modashahu pint mido yoshana. He said that Tosos Yomtov measured this was a volume called a pint. It's clear it's not a pint because we're talking here something over 2 liters. It was this measured volume called a pint. Shemot Sossi came to Prague, which I found when I came to Prague. The Noda B'Yehuda was drop in Prague. And I measured this 43.2 eggs. It was even a little bit less than this volume of a pint. So that's the 43.2 eggs worth. But shuv, and then I then made a vessel based on the measurement of the Ramah. You said it's 6 7/9 of a finger breadth cubed. So I made a vessel based on the finger breadth measurement. And this vessel contained a little more than 8 zeidlach, which is 2 pint. The 2 volumes of challah mentioned in Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah would seem to contradict each other. The first one, he said, was a little bit less than a pint. And the second measurement, he said, comes out at 2 pint. But the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah implies these are the same. Both of these shiurim and the way they interrelate comes as halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai. So one can't say they contradict each other. There was a fixed relationship between these vessels handed down from Sinai. So what do we do with this difficulty? So one has to say that something has changed between the time of the Gemara and the time when I'm now in Prague doing this experiment. And I've got 2 options. It could be that the finger breadth and the finger breadth that I've used have got bigger since the time of Chazal. And that the finger breadths that we have now are bigger than those in the time of Chazal. That's option 1. Option 2, or the eggs, which we see nowadays, are smaller than the ones they had in the time of Chazal. And that they are smaller than those in the days of the Kassanai. So we have 2 options. And because the shiur mismatch, we can either say the finger breadth that I did, that the Noda B'Yehuda did this on, was bigger than the times of Chazal, or the egg that he was doing it on was smaller than the times of Chazal. And he gives a very interesting argument about how to decide which of these is the likely culprit. Now we know that the generations are going and reducing. This is the idea which we normally call Yeridas Hadoros, the idea that generations have got lesser in stature over time. Now, we normally consider this in a spiritual stature, that those of earlier generations were of greater spiritual level than us, that the Rishonim were greater than the Achronim, and the Amoraim were greater than the Rishonim, and the Tanaim were greater than the Amoraim. But the Noda B'Yehuda takes this idea and says, not only is this a spiritual idea, this would also be a physical one. And that the physical size of people in the time of Chazal, or the physical time of eggs in the time of Chazal, must have been bigger then and reduced now. It would not be logical. It doesn't make sense to me to say that actually the finger breadth that I'm using here is bigger than the one in the time of Chazal. I would say that it has to be that the eggs have got smaller from the time of Chazal, rather than saying that our fingers have got bigger since the time of Chazal. So if we say that the eggs have got smaller since the time of Chazal, according to the Noda B'Yehuda's measurements, we have to say that the eggs would double the size in the time of Chazal than they are as we find them now. And the Chazon Ish, this view of the Noda B'Yehuda is commonly quoted by, in the name of the Chazon Ish, as the Chazon Ish shir. And he says, since this view was set by the Noda B'Yehuda, and he also quotes the Gra, though I haven't seen this Gra inside, from this Bashta Haran, he says, this view of the Noda B'Yehuda, that eggs have halved in size since the time of Chazal, has spread. Based in the Chol Yisrael, he says poetically rather than necessarily strictly halachically, that it's as if a based in the Sanhedrin were fixed this for all of Klal Yisrael. So we assume that the eggs that we have now have indeed halved since the times of Chazal. And if we go back then, the Rav Chaim Noah measured an egg at roughly 57 odd centimeter cubed. So we have to say in the time of Chazal it was about 114 centimeter cubed. And I call this view 1b and 2b because this then modifies the views which are based on a kibetza. So if you say that we need a half a kibetza or a third of a kibetza, but the egg is based on the egg in the time of Chazal, you have to double that volume relative to the size of a modern egg. And there's a table a little bit further down which will show how those volumes compare, but we will get there soon. So it said this is the view of the Noda B'Yehuda quoted by the Chazon Ish, that eggs have halved in size since the time of Chazal. And now the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Tov Pei Vov, which is, as we said, was the Siman where it talks about how much matzah one needs to eat. So he paskins how much matzah one should have on Seder night. And he says we have these two machlokas over here. We have a machlokas whether a kibetza is, whether a kezayis is half a kibetza or a third of a kibetza. And we also have a view that eggs have halved in size since the time of Chazal. And Mishnah Berurah says well, eating matzah on Seder night is a Torah mitzvah. And therefore we would follow the principle of Sofek D'Oraisa L'Chumra. If you have a doubt about Torah law, one should be strict. And therefore he advocates eating the volume of matzah on Seder night, which is half an egg, based on an egg in the times of Chazal. Now, and if the eggs in the time of Chazal would double that which they are now, that means one should have to eat a kibetza, an egg's worth in volume of matzah on Seder night. And that's how the Mishnah Berurah paskins, at least for Torah mitzvahs. By Mara, he says maybe you can rely on the more lenient measurements, but for Torah mitzvahs, the Mishnah Berurah says to eat a kezayis of matzah, one would have to eat a kibetza, an amount equal to the size of a modern egg. And that's the Mishnah Berurah at least partially endorsing the view of the Noda B'Yehuda. However, there are certainly challenges to this view of the Noda B'Yehuda. And source number 18, the Chasam Sofer, brings a challenge to this. I have a big problem with this. So, as we said, a modern egg really is the size of an olive in the time of Chazal. So as we say on the stage, like Hillel wrapped a kezayis of korban pesach, a kezayis of matzah, a kezayis of morer, and he ate them all together. And eating them all together doesn't just mean in a sandwich which he ate over 10 minutes. He would be able to fit them all inside his mouth. He says, could you honestly eat, if you say a kezayis is the size of a modern egg, could a person eat 3 eggs full and put it in one's mouth and swallow in one go? This is completely impossible for a person to swallow, even if it was crushed up. There's no way that Hillel could have eaten 3 kezesim as part of his Kerech on Seder night if you followed the view of the Noda B'Yehuda. And so there's an anecdote I heard, I think, I seem to remember hearing in a shir from the Shechter, where he quoted Moshe Feinstein. Moshe Feinstein said that he tried to replicate this experiment of the Noda B'Yehuda. And he built this vessel based on the finger breadths and compared it to the eggs, and he said they always matched up. He couldn't see how the Noda B'Yehuda ended up in a situation where his vessel based on finger breadth was double the size of that in eggs. Now, Rav Shechter pointed out that whilst Rav Moshe was a Torah giant, he was quite diminutive in stature. And therefore, the finger breadth of Rav Moshe Feinstein was likely relatively small. And so presumably that is the Noda B'Yehuda was bigger. So there would have been some difference in the finger breadth that they'd been using to make this vessel based on the finger breadth measurement of the volume of flour that one needed for challah. And there's an interesting kind of mathematical point over here. You'll see that I've plotted a chart on the side. So the equation that we said above, based on the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Challah, was that one egg's volume was the same as 7.2 finger breadths cubed. So what you end up with here, and for those who maths has long been forgotten since the time of school, please forgive me, but you end up with a polynomial equation where an egg is weighted to the cubed value of a finger. And this actually means that if you plot one egg, the volume of an egg on the y-axis and the volume of a finger and the size of a finger breadth on the x-axis, the volume is very sensitive to the finger breadth that you use. And what I've shown on the chart is if you use a finger breadth of roughly 2 centimeters, then that would give you 7.2 times 2 centimeter cubed, gives you roughly 60 centimeter cubed. So that gives you roughly the volume of an egg quoted by, adopted by Rav Chaim Naeh. Whereas if you use a finger breadth, which is only 2.5 centimeters, so it's only a half a centimeter bigger, because it's a cubed equation, you actually end up with a volume which is nearly double. So if you use a finger breadth of 2.5 centimeter cubed, you'd end up with the volume of an egg at roughly 120 centimeter cubed. So we see relatively small differences in the size of finger breadth that are being measured for this experiment make a very big difference in terms of the outcome of the volume. So what may well be going on over here between Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Noda B'Yehuda, and how the Chasam Sofer would answer this, is maybe the Noda B'Yehuda's finger was larger than average when he was making this measurement, and that the finger breadth that he used was actually larger than that of Chazal, and therefore he was ending up with a vessel which was too big. But if you're going based on a finger breadth of kind of 1.92 centimeters, then you would end up with a volume of an egg which is around about the 55-60 centimeters that Rav Chaim Naeh equates. So that was the view of the Noda B'Yehuda, who said that actually an egg in today's times is half that of the times of Chazal, and therefore if you relate an olive to an egg, then you'd have to relate it to the bigger egg in the time of Chazal. The Chasam Sofer argues on this, and it's interestingly just kind of from historical evidence in source number 19, that Tzitz Eliezer. And he quotes Hagon Rav Avram Kook Zatzal. So this is Eliezer held Rav Kook in a very high regard, and he saw written in the name of Rav Kook, that he testified, Sheshoman and Mona. He heard reliable testimony, Bizman ha'acharon beitzim chanutis b'Mitzrayim, that they found in Egypt embalmed eggs from centuries or millennia ago. So they found eggs in ancient Egypt which had been preserved, and those eggs were exactly the same size as eggs which we have today. And this would support the view of the Chasam Sofer and the Rav Chaim Naeh that one would not say that eggs have halved in size since the time of Chazal. There's no, historically, archaeologically, that doesn't seem to be the case. And Rav Avram Lovat actually quotes Professor Felix, who said in Pompeii, where they had some very well preserved scenes from when the volcano erupted, they found eggs which were smaller still than the egg quoted by Rav Chaim Naeh, which were 40 odd centimeter cubed. So we see there's archaeological evidence to suggest that eggs have not shrunk in size since the time of Chazal, which would support the view of the Chasam Sofer. I'm conscious time is getting away from us a little bit. So we've had the two views decided that Kezayis is a third of an egg or a half of an egg. However, there is a third opinion over here, which really says actually it's not that prescriptively related to an egg, and that we can say Kezayis is actually, it relates to the size of a modern day olive, the olives which we see in front of us, which are certainly less than half an egg and generally probably even less than a third of an egg. And we see in source number 21 and 22, without putting them inside, the Rashba and the Ritva both indicate that they held that there were many more than just 2 or 3 olives in an egg volume. The Rashba just said that in 15 eggs there are far more than 60 olives. So one egg is bigger than, so that there are more than 4 olives volumes within one egg. And the Ritva similarly suggests likewise that they don't hold this equation that there are either 2 or 3 olives into the size of an egg. They clearly indicate there are many more olives than in the size of an egg. We'll skip source 23 just for lack of time. But we'll bring source 24, which gives us the kind of the key basis for the view that says it's based on the size of a modern olive. And we said based on the earlier volumes, one has to, you said certainly if you say it's an olive is half the size of an egg, you have to say olives nowadays are smaller than the time of Chazal, like the Node of Yehuda. And even probably if you said it's a third of the size of an egg, you would probably still have to say that the olives today are a little smaller than that. However, there's a fundamental tshuva which was discovered. This is of Rav Hai Gon, one of the Gaonim, written just after the period of the Gemara. There's a tshuva here of Rav Hai Gon, and there's a similar tshuva of Rav Shvira Gaon. And he explains why Chazal quoted different volumes and measures in relation to common produce. And this is the reason why the Torah specified volumes in terms of common produce like eggs and fruits such as olives. So these matters were given at Har Sinai, tradition handed down, which we learn out from the Psukim. There are various traditions handed down from Har Sinai, and the traditions of the volumes for different mitzvahs and aveiros were handed down from Sinai. So why did we use these common items like eggs and olives and so on? Because these items are commonly found and they should be found pretty much anywhere, and they give people a reference point. This is well before the days where people were able to measure things in milliliters and centimeters cubed with modern measuring equipment. So these common articles were fixed for the quantities in relation to various Torah-related areas. It was revealed in front of Hashem that the Jews were going to be exiled. The Chazal, who had the right to determine the quantities for different areas, they fixed it based on commonly available items like produce and eggs, that they are around everywhere, and this is the key word here, they do not change in size. And therefore Chazal Sinai set various shiurim based on common items, because these would be common everywhere and they do not change in size. And therefore, if one takes this shiva of Rav Hai Gon or Rav Shvira Gaon, who say that olives, eggs, none of these things we expect to change in volume, then very clearly when one is eating a kezayis of food, one needs to eat of an olive's worth. One should be measuring this based on the size of modern olives, which are present in our times. Now, this view of Rav Hai Gon and Rav Shvira Gaon is amongst the more modern poskim. Is first really ascribed to Rav Chaim Volozhin, the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva and a lead Talmud of the Gra. And he said that if you want the volume of a kezayis for eating matzah, for bracha achrona, all these different areas we discussed, should be the size of a modern olive. One need not start making all these equations about how an olive related to an egg and start considering whether an olive has shrunk or increased in, and eggs have shrunk or increased in size. We don't need to go there at all. We look based on the size of a modern olive. Now, in terms of how widely known the different opinions are, I think the view of Rav Chaim Nar, who says you basically for a kezayis you go based on half a modern egg, that is probably the most widely quoted and probably the most widely adopted halachic opinion. But interestingly, in source number 25, and a shout out to my brother Zach for helping me with this one, there is a book called The Halachos of a Kezayis by Rav Bodner, where he goes through and illustrates the site how much a kezayis is of different foods. And at the front of his sefer, he quotes a question and answer he had with Rav Chaim Kanievsky. And he says, we're not going to do it inside, but he said, actually, no, let's just do it inside. So I have a tradition from the Chazon Ish, that one would make a bracha achrona on a third of a modern egg. Now, this seems not dissimilar to the views that we had above, except until we consider the Chazon Ish trumpeted the view that the modern eggs were half the size of Chazal. And so a third, if you go on the view that it's a third of an egg, you'd have to go a third on the egg at the time of Chazal. But the Chazon Ish said you go based on the size of a third of a modern egg. How does this work? The Chazon Ish held this view of Rav Chaim Volozhin based on the Gaonim, that for bracha achroina you just need to eat a kezayis the size of a modern egg, a modern olive. Shipachas mishlish beta, which is less than a third of an egg. So why did he say a third of an egg? He says he says there are certain modern olives which are large in size, and therefore he said that one should look at the volume, which is a third of an egg, and only be making a bracha achroina based on that, because that's what he says roughly the large modern olives would be roughly a third of the volume of a modern egg. And there's I had that, sorry, there's a table above that I didn't delve into, but within there we said a third of it based on the modern day egg would be roughly 18 centimeters cubed. So the Chazon Ish trumpeted the view of the Rav Chaim Volozhin and based on the Gaonim, that for a kezayis you go based on the size of a modern olive. But the Chazon Ish was quite conservative about that volume and said you still need to eat a relatively large amount based on a third of the size of a modern egg for the bracha achroina, for eating matzah, etc. Now, interesting, I'll just skip till 27 for a minute. So the Chazon Ish says to go based on a third of the size of a modern egg to consider the size of olives. Now, Rav Sifkin, who has an article on this topic, he quotes different sizes of olives based on the different varieties. So he says there's a chamois variety of olive, I'm no expert, but he says those were 12 to 13 centimeter cube, those are large olives, and that's not far off the 17 or 18 centimeter cube that the Chazon Ish said. But he says there are small olives which are only half or even 1 centimeter cube, the Melisi, or the medium-sized one, or Suri or Nabli, which are roughly 3 to kind of 6 centimeters cubed in volume. And the Sefer Midas for Shirei Torah quotes a bit quoted by Rav Mordechai Willig. He also estimates the range of modern olives, depending on the type of olives you use, really between 3 and 7.5. And as we did point out above, the Mishnah in Kalim says you go based on a medium-sized olive. So one could argue, if one is going along the lines of Rav Chaim Volozhin, that it's based on a modern olive, that actually one doesn't need to have quite such a large share that the Chazon Ish said of 17 or 18 centimeter cubes, that one could be going really maybe anything from kind of 4 to 8 centimeter cube, maybe an estimate of how large medium-sized olives are. And just to wrap up with the last source, until 27, Rav Slifkin and the Midas Vashira Torah quotes a similar archaeological evidence in an article he has on Kezayis. They say at Masada they found many different olive pits. Some of them were from Nabli, but also Syrian Melisi varieties. And the olive pits, which were preserved from nearly 2,000 years ago, those were similar in size to the pits of modern olives, which would suggest that the olives that Chazal were considering in their time were actually similar size to the olives that we have now, consistent with the view that the Gaonim said that these shiurim don't really change over time. And similarly, in Eretz Yisrael, there are a number of olive trees which are 2,000 and some which are even 3,000 years old. So they date back right to the times of Chazal. And their olives on those trees we see are the same size as those on much younger trees. So these older trees don't seem to be producing olives which are really any smaller. So we've come towards the end of the source sheet. So just to summarize, we've seen the kind of 3 different approaches to the size of a kezayis. There's one view, which is which says we go based on half of the volume of an egg, which Rav Chaim Volozhin says in modern eggs is about 28 centimeters cubed. We had the Noda B'Yehuda who says the eggs have halved in size since the time of Chazal, so we'd have to double this, and therefore a kezayis 3 would be about 56 centimeters cubed. We had a second view, which was the Pri Chodosh based on the Rambam Shulchan Aruch, that it's kezayis is a third of the volume of an egg, and so based on a modern egg that would be roughly 18 centimeter cubed. Or based on the Noda B'Yehuda who says they've doubled that the eggs in the time of Chazal will double the size, that would be roughly 36 centimeter cubed. And then we have the view of Rav Chaim Volozhin, based on the Gaonim and indeed followed by the Chazon Ish, who says that one looks at modern olives and goes based on the size of modern olives. And there's some disputes about exactly how much, or what types of olives we consider in that. But if we're looking at medium-sized olives, that may well be something like 5, 6, 7 centimeter cubed. So that gives quite a lot of background about how many roglach one needs to eat in order to make a bracha achrona. I haven't translated each of these back into roglach, but we can see there's a broad range of opinions. As always, seek halachic advice where these are practical, especially questions around Seder night, how much matzah one needs to eat, especially if one has certain medical conditions. But hopefully this was useful to give background as to the three key opinions on the subject. Does anyone have any questions at the end of that? Please just take yourself off mute and ask if you do. Okay, if not, we'll leave that there. This will be the last session of the Monday night shiurim that we've been having since June. We do, please God, plan to continue this in a more fixed form. This was relatively ad hoc for now. We weren't, no one was quite sure how things were developing in terms of being able to give shiur at shul. But there does seem to be, it seems that we will continue giving a series of Zoom shiurim on Monday night from September time, and hopefully we'll have a kind of a fixed time and a fixed program for that going forward. But for now, thank you very much, everyone, for joining this evening.